If I had known that every dish my daughter-in-law cooked for me was laced with malice, I swear I wouldn't have taken a single bite. Her cakes, her juices, her creamy pasta, even her perfectly roasted chicken all tasted divine. But if it hadn't been for one accidental conversation with my grandson, I would have never discovered the terrifying secret hidden behind her kindness. Curious what she did to this old mother-in-law of hers. Then stay with me till the very end, because the real shock is waiting for those who don't look away. And tell me, my dear viewers, where are you watching this from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means more than you know. If you see me sitting here calmly, know that I wasn't always this composed. My name is Vanessa Keller, 68, a retired attorney who thought she had seen every kind of betrayal in court. I was wrong. The cruelest one happened in my own kitchen. Tonight, the house smells of cinnamon and baked apples. The pie is still warm, its crust golden and delicate. I sliced it slowly, watching the steam rise like ghosts of memories that refuse to leave. People say baking brings comfort, but for me, it now carries the taste of deceit. A week ago, I was lying in the hospital, dizzy and breathless, while my daughter-in-law Clara sat by my bed, holding my hand too tightly, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. She told everyone it was food poisoning from bad milk. But I knew better. There had been no milk in the recipe, only the pie she baked just for me. I can still hear her voice that night, soft and sweet, like honey hiding a blade. "You should rest, Mom," she said. "I'll take care of everything. Everything. Including my house, my accounts, my will." Now, as I cut another slice, the golden ring on my finger catches the light, the one my late husband gave me 40 years ago. Clara has always admired it, pretending it was affection, while her eyes followed it like prey. I smile faintly. If you had told me a month ago that my daughter-in-law would try to kill me for inheritance, I would have laughed. But when greed wears the face of family, even laughter feels dangerous. This kitchen used to be a place of comfort, where I made pumpkin pies for Thanksgiving and watched my son Adrian sneak extra slices. Now it feels colder, though the oven is still warm. I trace the edge of the plate and think of how easily trust crumbles, just like crust under a knife. The world outside is silent, but inside me something has shifted. I am not the helpless victim Clara thinks I am. She underestimated a lawyer who spent her life reading people's lies. If you see me calm, now, know that I almost died last week. And know this too, I don't intend to let her get away with it. It was late November, the kind of gray afternoon when the wind carries the scent of pine, and the sidewalks are buried under crisp red maple leaves. Christmas songs were already floating through the quiet streets of Cleveland Heights, Ohio. The whole neighborhood seemed wrapped in calm, preparing for the warmth of the holidays. From my kitchen window, I could see Clara's house across the street, her porch glowing with fairy lights, and a wreath perfectly centered on the door. She always knew how to put on a show. Clara Walters, my daughter-in-law, had built quite a reputation around here. Everyone admired her homemade touch, the pies, the cookies, the casseroles she delivered to neighbors with that modest smile and soft voice. People often said I was lucky to have such a sweet, generous daughter-in-law. I used to nod politely. They didn't see how her sweetness curdled when no one was watching. That morning, I received her message. "Mom, let me bake the pumpkin pie for you this year. I want everything to be extra special." The words looked harmless enough, but something about them made my chest tighten. Clara had never been the sentimental type. She only did things when there was something to gain. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a simple, "All right." In our family, Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. Every year, I baked the pumpkin pie myself using my late husband's recipe. It wasn't just dessert. It was a piece of memory. The idea of someone else making it felt like an intrusion. But I reminded myself that Adrian, my son, would want peace. He still believed Clara's charm was real, that her soft laughter meant kindness. On Thanksgiving morning, I watched from the window as Clara carried a large box from her car, smiling like a celebrity walking into her own premiere. She waved to the neighbors who greeted her with admiration. To them, she was the perfect homemaker in her cream sweater and pearl earrings. But when her eyes met mine for a brief second, her smile flickered. For that one heartbeat, I saw the truth, the cold, calculating gleam beneath the surface. I turned away, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe age was making me cynical. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't just a pie. It was an offering wrapped in deceit, a reunion dessert that tasted like danger. I've never considered myself a suspicious woman, but 30 years in law taught me one thing: people who look perfect are usually hiding something. Clara is no exception. She knows how to play her role beautifully: the devoted wife, the caring daughter-in-law, the neighbor who bakes cookies for everyone. But I've learned to listen, not just to what people say, but to what they ask for afterward. Every sweet gesture from her comes with a small request tucked neatly behind it like fine print in a shady contract. Each time she brings food, there's always a favor. Mom, could I borrow a little for the kids' school trip? Or that antique vase in your living room would look perfect in our house. Once she even asked for ingredients from my pantry: flour, sugar, butter, claiming she wanted to save a trip to the store. I let her, pretending not to notice the pattern. But the lawyer in me takes notes even when the grandmother in me wants peace. Sometimes I wonder if Clara realizes how transparent she's become. Her tone changes when she wants something. Her eyes soften just enough, and her hand lingers on my shoulder a second too long. I've seen that same performance from witnesses on the stand smiling while calculating their next lie. Maybe that's why I feel a chill when she calls me Mom. It's too practiced, too rehearsed. People say a smile is the best ingredient in cooking. I suppose that's true, unless the cook is stirring deceit into the batter. Clara's pies are always flawless, her crust golden, her filling rich and aromatic. But when she handed me that pumpkin pie last week, her smile lingered in a way that made my stomach turn before I even took a bite. There was sweetness in her voice, but not in her heart. As I stare at the freshly baked pie cooling on my counter, I can't help thinking about how easily kindness can be weaponized. Maybe that's the curse of age: you start seeing the strings behind every kind act. I used to believe goodness was its own reward. Now I'm not so sure. Does kindness have an expiration date, or is it just a convenient disguise people wear until they get what they want? The afternoon sun poured through the kitchen window, painting the counter in shades of gold. My grandson Ethan, 7 years old and endlessly curious, was helping me decorate the dining table. He was humming a Christmas tune, his small hands carefully placing napkins shaped like little turkeys. His laughter filled the room with a warmth I hadn't felt in days. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful, ordinary, almost safe. "Grandma," he said suddenly, sniffing the air, "Mom bought a new spice jar. It smells weird." He giggled, wrinkling his nose. "She said it's her secret cinnamon blend." The words hit me like a shard of glass cutting through silk. My smile froze before I could stop it. "Her cinnamon blend?" I asked lightly, trying not to alarm him. "Yeah," Ethan said, pointing toward the spice rack. "That one, the one with the red sticker. Mom said not to touch it because it's special." I turned my head slowly. There it was on the top shelf, a small glass jar with a neat white label that read "Cinnamon Blend" in Clara's handwriting. It looked innocent, like everything she touched. The sunlight caught the jar, making the powder inside glimmer faintly. I reached for it, my hand steady, but my heartbeat not. The scent was off. Cinnamon should feel warm and familiar like holidays and cookies. But this smelled sharp, metallic, almost bitter beneath the sweetness. I had spent years studying evidence parsing details others missed, and this didn't feel right. I placed the jar back carefully, my fingers trembling slightly. Ethan had already moved on, humming again, lining up the silverware, crookedly proud of his artistic touch. I smiled at him, though my mind was already racing ahead. Clara had brought this jar a week before my sudden illness. She had called it her little touch of love. Now the phrase twisted inside me like a knife. I felt that old instinct rising, the one I hadn't used since my courtroom days. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just paranoia. It was pattern, motive, opportunity, all the things that once made me good at my job. I looked again at the jar. The sunlight no longer felt warm. It felt like a spotlight. Maybe this was how truth begins, not with a confession, but with a child's innocent comment and a mother-in-law's intuition refusing to die. The door had barely closed behind Clara when silence fell over the house like a heavy curtain. The faint echo of her cheerful goodbye still lingered in the air, too sweet, too rehearsed. I waited a moment, listening to the ticking clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator before walking slowly toward the kitchen counter. The jar sat there, small, harmless looking, its label neat and clean, cinnamon blend. I unscrewed the lid. A sharp, bitter smell hit me instantly. My stomach tightened. This wasn't cinnamon. There was no warmth, no sweetness, only a chemical tang that burned my nose and clung to my throat. I had smelled it before years ago in a courtroom filled with grief and greed. Benzodiazepine, a mild sedative, colorless when dissolved, easy to mix into food or drink. It dulls the mind, clouds judgment, slows reflexes. For most people, it means confusion and drowsiness. For someone my age, it could mean much worse. I closed the jar, hands steady but cold. My brain, trained by decades in law, began connecting dots faster than my heart could keep up. Clara's sudden affection, the special pie, her insistence that I rest more, her gentle suggestion last week to review my will for updates. All of it formed a pattern so obvious I wanted to laugh. I'd spent years defending the elderly from exploitation, and now I was living the very story I used to prosecute. The memory came rushing back, a case from 15 years ago. An old woman coerced by her son to sign away her estate after drinking tea laced with a similar drug. I remember how the son cried in court, how the mother trembled on the stand, and how justice eventually caught up to him. I had won that case, but the victory had left a scar. I never imagined I would one day stand on the other side of it. I leaned against the counter, staring at the sunlight glinting off the glass jar. My reflection looked strange, older, yes, but sharper too. The years hadn't dulled me. They'd only taught me patience. Clara thought she was clever, but she had made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the lawyer she was trying to poison. I whispered to the empty kitchen, my voice calm, almost detached. I've won hundreds of inheritance cases, but I never thought the next person to try and steal from me would be the one who calls me mother. The house on Fairmount Boulevard had stood for nearly a century, its red brick walls soaked with the quiet dignity of time. I'd lived here for 40 years, long enough to see the garden trees grow from saplings into a canopy that shaded the porch every summer. This house was more than wood and stone, it was memory. My husband, Richard Keller, had bought it when he was still a junior partner at the construction firm we later built together. Every corner of it carries his touch, from the oak handrails he polished himself to the study where he kept his blueprints rolled in neat rows. Since he passed away 2 years ago, the house has felt too large, too still. I retired soon after, content with a steady pension and the trust fund Richard left behind, his remaining shares in the company, carefully placed under my name. It isn't a fortune, but it's enough to live comfortably, to keep things in order the way he would have liked. I manage it with the same discipline I once brought to court. No emotional spending, no rash decisions, every receipt kept in a leather folder that still smells faintly of cedar. People often assume that solitude weakens you. It doesn't. It clarifies you. My days are simple but precise. I wake early, brew coffee, check the market reports, and jot down notes in my old ledger habit, not necessity. Some mornings, I still read case summaries for pleasure. Old instincts die hard. Once a lawyer, always a lawyer. And sometimes when an elderly neighbor asks for help deciphering a contract or avoiding a scam, I find myself smiling again, reminded that even quiet lives can serve a purpose. Clara doesn't understand that kind of order. To her, my life must look dull, a house filled with paper rules and silence. But there's comfort in structure. The law, after all, is about truth, and truth is all I have left to hold on to. I'm not a woman who needs company, I need clarity. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit by the window where Richard used to read the newspaper and watch the streetlights flicker on. The world outside moves faster now. New neighbors, new cars, new chaos. Inside, I keep my pace. Maybe that's what age is, not slowing down, but refusing to rush. I may not have many people to talk to, but at least my papers never lie to me. Adrian has always been a gentle soul. Even as a child, he hated confrontation. When other boys fought over toys, he was the one who gave his away just to keep the peace. That part of him never changed, even after he grew up, became a software engineer, and built a quiet life just one neighborhood away from mine. He has his father's calm voice and my tendency to overthink, but somewhere along the way, love turned that softness into something dangerous: obedience. Clara molded him the way a sculptor shapes clay. She didn't shout or demand. She sighed, pouted, and let silence do the work. Adrian mistook that manipulation for tenderness. "She's sensitive, Mom," he once said, as if that excused everything. I remember nodding, biting back the urge to remind him that sensitivity isn't the same as virtue. He lives only a few blocks away, yet the distance feels wider than states. He calls when Clara is busy or out with friends. When she's home, his voice on the phone is short or cautious, like every word is being weighed before release. The last time he visited, he stayed only 30 minutes, glancing at his watch every few minutes. "Clara's waiting," he said apologetically, as though his wife were a warden keeping time. I've noticed the way he looks at me now, not with love or warmth, but with calculation, as if gauging how much affection he's allowed to show without upsetting someone else. It's the kind of look I've seen in courtrooms from witnesses torn between truth and loyalty. Once he was my boy, the one who used to run into my arms after school, smelling of chalk and summer. Now, when we hug, it feels rehearsed, polite, almost foreign. I don't hate Clara for this. Manipulation is her craft, and she's good at it. But I do resent how willingly he lets himself be managed. Love should inspire strength, not erase judgment. He calls it devotion, but I know better. It's surrender dressed as romance. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what his father would say if he could see him now. Richard believed a man's first duty was to protect his integrity even from the people he loved. Adrian doesn't understand that yet. Maybe he will one day when the truth finally forces his eyes open. Until then, I watch in silence because there are battles even a mother cannot fight for her son. Clara Walters has the kind of grace that photographs well. She's the woman every neighbor praises at block parties, the one who wears pale linen dresses, keeps her hair neatly pinned, and speaks in a voice so soft it could pass for kindness. People see her and think what a blessing for an older woman to have such a gentle daughter-in-law. They don't see the calculation hiding behind that composure. She often shows up at my doorstep, holding a tray of something homemade cookies, still warm chicken soup that smells faintly of rosemary or freshly squeezed juice she claims is good for my energy. The neighbors think it's touching. I think it's strategy. Clara doesn't do anything without reason. Each act of care comes wrapped around a favor, small enough to sound harmless, yet always leading to something larger. Me, oi, she says sweetly. I forgot my wallet. Could you sign the utility bill for me, Mom? The kids are starting music lessons. Would you mind lending us a little until payday? Or her favorite. That watch your husband used to wear. It must mean so much to you. Why don't I keep it safe at our place? Even her kindness has a price tag. Last month, she looked at me with those earnest eyes and said, I worry about you being alone, Mom. Why don't you move in with us? You'll have company, and I can take care of you. It sounded caring, but beneath that invitation, I heard the sound of doors locking. She doesn't want to take care of me. She wants control of my schedule, my finances, my will. To outsiders, she is the perfect daughter-in-law, baking love into every loaf of bread and sprinkling sweetness into every word. But to me, she's a woman who's mastered the art of gentle theft. She never grabs. She guides your hand until you offer what she wants yourself. That's how manipulation works. It feels like generosity until you realize you've been emptied. I've met many like her in courtrooms, women who smile as they win, who wear decency like perfume. But Clara is sharper, more patient. She plays the long game, and she thinks I'm too old to notice. She's wrong, because I understand her type better than she realizes. They don't steal by force. They simply make you believe it was your idea to give. Clara has a talent for turning guilt into a weapon. She never raises her voice, never argues outright. Instead, she lets silence stretch just long enough to make you feel cruel for saying no. When I hesitate, she looks down, her eyes shimmering like a wounded child's, and whispers, Mom, you don't trust me. The words sound fragile, but they cut deep because they aren't a question. They're a trap. I started noticing small changes, the kind you'd miss if you weren't trained to look. A note I kept in my drawer, recording a small loan I gave her last spring, vanished without a trace. A birthday envelope meant for Ethan ended up misplaced, though Clara swore she'd mailed it to the school. Her explanations were always perfect, delivered with just the right mix of regret and innocence. Then came the day I opened my email to find a digital receipt for a furniture purchase I never made. The signature on the confirmation page looked eerily familiar, my name written in my exact handwriting. I printed the document, studied every curve of the letters, and felt a cold realization settle in my chest. When I confronted Clara, she gasped, hand to her heart, her voice trembling. Oh, Mom, that must have been a system mix-up. You know how online forms save info automatically? She even laughed softly as if to comfort me, as if my suspicion were silly. But I've spent my life reading lies disguised as paperwork. Her performance was polished, but not flawless. The tone of her voice had that faint quiver of overacting, too careful, too emotional. The kind of sweetness that tastes sour once you've swallowed it. That night, I didn't argue or accuse. I just sat at my desk, turned on the lamp, and began printing my bank statements every month, neatly labeled and stacked. I highlighted transactions that didn't add up, underlined dates that didn't match her stories. Each page felt like a quiet act of defiance, the start of a record I'd one day need. I've learned that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits patient and silent inside a folder. Before closing the drawer, I wrote a note to myself on the last page. Never trust warm tears. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. Tears can shine like sincerity, but behind them, motives drip just as clearly. Clara believes emotion can erase suspicion. She doesn't know she's teaching me how to build my case. At first, it started with little things, just until payday, as Clara liked to say. Small amounts that disappeared without return, like drops of rain absorbed by soil. I didn't mind not at first. It felt kinder to stay silent. But kindness has limits. And experience teaches you to recognize when generosity becomes a pattern of exploitation. So one afternoon over tea, when she hinted at another tiny favor, I smiled and said softly, "My pension isn't much, dear. I'm trying to be careful these days." Something shifted in her eyes, just a flicker, but sharp enough to cut through the room's calm. The next time she came over, her tone had changed. The cookies were still sweet, but her conversation wasn't. She started talking about planning ahead, about how the house was too big for one person, and how estate taxes can be such a burden if not handled early. Her words danced lightly, but every syllable carried weight. I listened without interrupting, stirring my tea slowly. Clara smiled as if she were doing me a favor, as if her sudden concern for my future wasn't rooted in greed. Then came Adrian's part, hesitant, rehearsed eyes avoiding mine. "Mom," he said one evening, "maybe it's time to make things official. Put everything in order so there's no confusion later." There it was, the voice I once loved, now trembling under the influence of someone else's ambition. I saw the hesitation in him, the discomfort of a man torn between affection and persuasion. He wasn't malicious, only weak. But weakness in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. I sat back, folded my hands, and smiled faintly. I had seen this play before, dozens of times across the courtroom table. The words changed, but the melody stayed the same. The gentle push, the reasonable tone, the mask of concern concealing appetite. That night, I opened my leather notebook, the same one I used during my years of practice. Its pages smelled faintly of ink and time. On a fresh page, I wrote, "I've witnessed many inheritance frauds, but this time I may be the living evidence." Then I underlined it twice. I didn't feel fear, only clarity. There's a moment when deception stops being subtle, when greed finally steps into the light. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Clara believed she was cornering an old woman. She didn't realize she had just awakened the lawyer who never loses a case. Clara's control grew like ivy, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. It started with small things, practical things. She began managing Adrian's credit card, saying it was easier to keep track of expenses. Then came the email passwords, the work calendar, the grocery list. Soon, even his free time wasn't his own. I watched it happen from a distance each week, shrinking the space he had left to breathe. One morning, I called to ask if Adrian could drive me to my doctor's appointment. My knee had been acting up again, and I didn't want to bother anyone else. He hesitated. I could hear Clara in the background, her tone light but firm. Then his voice came quieter now, almost apologetic. "Mom, Clara thinks maybe it's better if you rest at home. With the cost of health care and all. She just wants you to save your energy." Save my energy. That phrase hung in the air, cold and patronizing. What she meant was save your independence. I could hear the guilt in his tone, the familiar tension of a man trying to please everyone and failing both. He wasn't cruel, just afraid of conflict, of losing peace, of displeasing a woman who had mastered the art of gentle domination. I didn't argue. I thanked him, told him I'd manage, and hung up. Then I sat at my desk and stared at the phone, feeling something between sadness and recognition. I'd seen this before many times in court. The pattern was unmistakable: isolation, dependency, control masked as care. They called it cutting contact, a slow method of erasing a person's support network until they have no one left but the abuser. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea, opened my notebook, and began to write. Elder control, I noted in the margin, the words neat and deliberate. Case in progress. Beneath it, I added victim myself. Suspect, daughter-in-law. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. For years, I'd fought these battles for others, women who didn't have the education, the courage, or the resources to protect themselves. Now here I was, a retired attorney, trapped in a familiar case I'd once prosecuted. But I wasn't the same as my former clients. I still had my mind, my discipline, my records, and above all, my patience. Clara might think she was winning, but she was only revealing her hand one controlling move at a time. And as I closed my notebook that night, I whispered the reminder that had guided me through decades of legal practice: the law always catches up, even when love tries to hide the crime. It started subtly, too subtly to raise alarm at first. I would wake up dizzy, the room spinning in slow circles, my thoughts wrapped in fog. Some days I forgot what I'd been reading only minutes before. Other days I'd sleep through entire afternoons, something I'd never done in my life. At first I blamed age. 70 isn't young, I told myself. Maybe my body was simply reminding me of that. But then the pattern began to whisper. Each time I felt weak, there was always something Clara had brought: a slice of her famous apple pie, a glass of orange juice freshly squeezed for Mom. The symptoms came quietly but consistently: sluggish heartbeat, heavy eyelids, the kind of drowsiness that pulls you down like deep water. I would wake up hours later, disoriented with the faint aftertaste of cinnamon and citrus still clinging to my tongue. Lawyers don't believe in coincidences. We believe in evidence. So I started keeping a record. In a small notebook I kept by my bedside, I wrote the details: dates, times, what I ate, how I felt after. It was my instinct to document, to see the invisible thread that others might miss. After all, truth often hides in patterns. Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. Orange juice delivered by Clara. Heart rate slowed, felt faint after 15 minutes. Friday, 7:00 p.m. Slice of apple pie after dinner. Slept 10 hours straight. Couldn't recall last 2 hours before bed. Reading those lines later made my skin crawl. I had built a career on detecting schemes exactly like this, but I had never imagined being inside one. I watched the evidence pile up like quiet warnings. The handwriting grew shakier each day, but the facts didn't change. When Clara came by the next morning carrying another tray of something light and healthy, I forced a smile. "You're too kind," I said, taking the plate carefully, the way one might handle a snake disguised in ribbon. She beamed, proud of her devotion. To her, I was old, slow, harmless. She didn't know that every bite was now being documented, every reaction measured. That night, I sat by the window with my journal open on my lap, the lamplight trembling across the page. My hand moved slowly as I wrote the words that made my chest tighten. After orange juice, Tuesday, pulse slowed. After apple pie. Friday, prolonged drowsiness. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was proof beginning to take shape. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel tired. I felt awake. "Clara," I said softly, stirring the untouched glass of orange juice between my fingers. "Did you add something new to this? Some kind of supplement, maybe?" Her lips curved into that familiar, harmless smile, the one she used when she wanted to seem innocent. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice as light as air. "I just thought it might help you sleep better. You've been looking so tired lately." The way she said it made my skin prickle. Her tone was sugar, but her eyes gave her away. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the stack of medical papers on the table, the ones detailing my blood pressure, my prescriptions, my most recent checkup. It wasn't care in her gaze. It was calculation. "You should accept that you're getting older," she added gently, still smiling. "It's normal to need a little help sometimes." There it was, the shift small but sharp. Concern turned into authority. For months, she'd wrapped her control in affection, soft words, baked goods, and sweet smiles. But now the mask slipped. Her voice was calm, her gestures precise, like someone testing how far they could push before being caught. Something inside me hardened. I met her gaze for the first time, and for a brief moment, the room went quiet. only the slow ticking of the clock between us. I could almost hear the line snapping, that invisible thread that separates love from manipulation. I smiled faintly. You know, I said my tone's steady in law, giving someone medication without permission. Even something mild has a name. It's called administering without consent. Her face froze for just a second. Then the smile returned tighter this time. You always talk like a lawyer, Mom. You should really try to relax. I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the glass down carefully, the citrus scent suddenly sharp and sour in the air. The silence between us stretched thin as glass. For years, she'd been playing a role, the perfect daughter-in-law, all kindness and gentleness. But now, for the first time, I saw her teeth behind the smile. And I knew this was no misunderstanding. It was a move, a test. And I had just shown her that I recognized the game. When I first mentioned to Adrian that something about Clara's drinks and desserts made me feel strange, he didn't even hesitate. Mom, he said quickly, shaking his head, you know Clara would never do anything to hurt you. His tone carried that mix of protectiveness and impatience that sons use when they think their mothers are being unreasonable. It was the same tone he used to defend her, cooking her, spending her every word. He didn't realize it, but his loyalty had stopped belonging to reason. It now belonged entirely to her. Before I could respond, Clara stepped closer, her performance flawless. She turned to Adrian with tears glistening at the corners of her eyes, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. I only worry about your mom, she said softly. I'm scared she doesn't like me anymore. I'm scared of losing her. Then she buried her face against his shoulder and began to cry delicate, rehearsed sobs that seemed to echo through the quiet room. Adrian froze for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her like a reflex. Don't cry, honey, he whispered, brushing her hair back. Mom doesn't mean it that way. His eyes were wet now, too red from guilt and confusion. Watching them, I realized the scene wasn't about truth anymore. It was about emotion, weaponized and precisely aimed. Clara didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. She made me the aggressor just by appearing wounded. I stood there silent, feeling a chill settle inside me. Years of courtroom experience had taught me how emotion can manipulate judgment faster than any argument. I had seen witnesses cry to sway juries, but this was different. This was my son, the boy who once believed I could fix anything, now comforting the woman, quietly tightening the noose around us both. Clara glanced up for a brief second, long enough to meet my eyes over Adrian's shoulder. There was no trace of tears in her expression, then only triumph, calm and cold. It was a look I had seen before in defendants who knew they'd won the jury before the verdict was even read. I forced a small smile and turned away, pretending not to notice. Inside, a bitter truth was setting in. She didn't need poison to isolate me. She only needed his heart, and she already had it. It was one of those evenings that looked perfect from the outside. The table was set with linen napkins, silverware polished to a mirror shine, candles flickering softly. Clara had outdone herself. Roasted duck-mashed potatoes, a bottle of Merlot, breathing beside a crystal decanter. A cozy family dinner, she'd called it. Adrian looked proud, mistaking performance for love. I could almost pity him. As we sat down, Clara filled our glasses with practiced grace. Her movements were elegant, deliberate, as if she were hosting royalty instead of her aging mother-in-law. To family, she said, raising her glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I returned the gesture politely, though a small unease stirred in me. Halfway through the meal, she leaned forward, her voice honeyed and casual. Mom, she began, tilting her head slightly, if one day you're no longer with us, who would you leave this house to? The question hung in the air like smoke. For a heartbeat, even the clinking of silverware stopped. I felt the stem of my wine glass cold against my fingers. She said it so softly, so sweetly that it could almost pass for curiosity. But I saw the glint in her eyes. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. The soft thrust of a blade wrapped in velvet. Adrian didn't notice. He was too busy cutting his steak, humming under his breath. But Clara's gaze stayed on me, unblinking bright with anticipation. She was hunting for a reaction, for a flicker of weakness. And for a split second, I gave her the pause of surprise before instinct took over. I set my glass down slowly, the sound crisp against the tablecloth. Then I met her stare and smiled, thin and calm. If I still remember that question tomorrow, I said lightly, perhaps I'll answer it. Her expression faltered just slightly, confusion flickering before she regained her poise. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it," she said quickly, her tone dripping innocence. But I saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the faint flush at her neck. The mask had slipped for just a moment, enough for me to glimpse the ambition beneath. I lifted my fork again, taking a small bite of the duck, pretending not to notice the tension that had replaced the warmth in the room. My smile never left, though. Inside, I was already filing the moment away, date-time motive. Clara thought she was being subtle, testing the edges of the will she so desperately wanted to rewrite. But I had been in this game far longer than she'd been alive. And if she wanted a battle over this house, she'd soon learn I don't lose the things I built with my own hands. Thanksgiving arrived with all the false warmth of a holiday postcard. The house smelled of cinnamon nutmeg and baked crust, the familiar scent of family comfort, and this year danger. Clara had insisted on baking the pumpkin pie herself. "It's my new recipe," she said, eyes bright with pride. A little French twist. "You'll love it, Mom." Her voice was syrupy, too careful, the kind of sweetness that tries too hard to hide something bitter underneath. That afternoon, as I set the table with my grandson, he looked up at me and said innocently, "Mom says her pie will help you sleep better, Grandma. It has a secret spice." He giggled, proud of knowing a grown-up secret. My smile didn't reach my eyes. I bent down, brushed his hair gently, and asked, "A secret spice, huh? That sounds fancy." He nodded eagerly, and I felt the air in my lungs grow heavier. Later, when no one was looking, I went to the kitchen. A small jar labeled cinnamon blend sat near the oven, the same one she had used before. I dipped a spoon into the mixture just enough to collect a trace and sealed it in a tiny plastic bag. My private nurse, Karen, still came by once a week. The next morning, I handed her the sample and asked her to send it to a lab. No explanations, just a look that told her this wasn't a casual favor. 2 days later, the results arrived. The spice contained a microdose of a sedative compound, a cognitive suppressant, the kind once used in cases where elderly patients were manipulated into signing documents they didn't understand. It wouldn't kill me. It would only make me forget. Convenient if one wanted a signature without resistance. When Clara showed up that evening, smiling too brightly, holding a neat stack of papers, my suspicion turned into certainty. "Mom," she began sweetly, "this is just a temporary maintenance authorization for the house. You know, in case something happens, it's better if I can handle the bills." I looked down at the papers, my heart steady. "Of course, dear," I murmured, reaching for a pen. My fingers moved slowly, trembling just enough to look weak. I signed, but not my name. Just a swirl of wrong letters, messy and illegible. Then I smiled. "I hope that's all right. I'm not as sharp as I used to be." Clara hesitated, blinking. "Oh, of course, Mom," she said quickly, masking her frustration with another grin. She didn't realize she'd just walked into my trap. I wasn't the one losing memory. I was building evidence. That night, sleep didn't come. The memory of that strange, bitter smell from the spice jar kept circling in my mind like a quiet alarm. Around midnight, I got up, slipped into my robe, and walked to the study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. The the scent of my other life, the one before retirement. I opened the filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in years, the drawers filled with ghosts of past battles. Case files, depositions, testimonies, my silent trophies from decades in law. I began sorting through them one by one, my hands steady, despite the tremor in my chest. Somewhere between the files labeled elder protection and fraudulent transfers, I found a case from 15 years ago. The headline typed neatly across the front: "Caregiver convicted after drugging elderly employer with benzodiazepine to obtain property transfer." I remembered that woman clearly, quiet, polite, always smiling for the neighbors, much like Clara. I flipped through the pages, eyes tracing my old handwritten notes. One line leapt out at me, circled twice in red ink. "You don't need violence to kill a person's memory." I stared at that sentence for a long time, feeling its weight settle deep inside me. Clara had never raised her voice, never shown open cruelty. Her methods were softer, more efficient, the same poison disguised as care. I leaned back in my chair, the cold truth unfolding like an old wound reopening. For years I had fought to protect the elderly from predators who wore compassion like perfume. Now one of them sat at my own table, calling me Mom. The clock ticked toward 2 a.m. I poured myself a cup of cold coffee, opened a fresh notebook, and began writing a new case file, this time my own. On the first page, I wrote Keller versus Walters, suspicion of cognitive manipulation and attempted property fraud. Beneath it, I listed evidence: the spice jar, the medical report, the forged signature attempt, and Clara's repeated offers to help. My handwriting was calm, measured the way it had always been in court. As I closed the old case folder, I whispered to the empty room, "I may be retired, but the law in me isn't." Retirement ends when justice is challenged, and this time, justice had chosen my doorstep. From that moment, I stopped thinking like a mother-in-law and started thinking like a lawyer again. Clara thought she was hunting a victim. She didn't realize she'd awakened a prosecutor. The next morning, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Connor Hastings. We'd tried cases together back when the courtroom still felt like home. He was 72 now, technically retired, though no one in the Ohio legal circuit truly believed he'd ever stop working. When he answered, his voice was still sharp, carrying that dry wit I remembered. "Vanessa Keller," he said, half amused, half curious. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Don't tell me you're coming out of retirement to compete with me." I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "Not exactly. I have a case, Connor, but this time the client is me." There was a short silence on the line, the kind that only two old lawyers share when they both understand the weight behind a sentence. Then came the familiar sigh. "Tell me everything," he said. I explained carefully, methodically, about the strange spices, the forged document, the suspiciously gentle daughter-in-law. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he cleared his throat. "It's a solid start," he said. "But if you want this to hold in court, you can't confront her yet. You have to let her make her own mistake, and you must catch it lawfully. No tricks that could get evidence thrown out." His tone was steady, pragmatic. I'd always admired that about him, the way his mind never clouded with outrage, even when justice was personal. So I asked, "What do you suggest?" "There's a statute you can use," he replied. "Ohio's Elder Safety Recording Clause. It allows discreet video or audio monitoring if there's reasonable suspicion of elder abuse. Install the cameras, legally document everything, and when she crosses the line, you'll have your case." I took notes as he spoke, the pen gliding across the page like it used to in my office years ago. The old rhythm was back, the calm before battle, the quiet excitement of a mind sharpening itself. "Connor," I said finally, "you always did know how to make the law feel like armor." When I hung up, the sun was rising through the kitchen window, spilling gold over the table where Clara had once set her poisoned kindness. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel cornered. I felt like myself again, the attorney who never lost when truth was on her side. Justice doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. The opportunity came during Christmas week. Clara, as usual, insisted on hosting. "You shouldn't tire yourself, Mom," she said sweetly. "Let me take care of dessert. I've perfected the pumpkin pie." Her voice was cheerful, but her eyes lingered on my hands a second too long, like a magician waiting for applause. What Clara didn't know was that a small camera installed under the pretext of elder safety now watched over the kitchen. That night, the footage captured her standing by the counter, unscrewing the lid of the spice jar and carefully pouring a fine white powder into the pumpkin filling. She stirred slowly, then spoke into her phone, her tone light, almost casual. "Once she signs the papers, it's done," she said. "We can finally move on." Margaret and I watched in silence from the adjoining room, my pulse steady, my expression blank. It was surreal, the same woman who kissed my cheek every Sunday, now caught mid-crime under soft Christmas lights. When she served the pie, I played my role perfectly. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted the fork. "Smells wonderful, dear," I said, taking a delicate bite. It tasted sweet cinnamon cream and betrayal. Clara watched me closely, her smile flickering with anticipation. I waited 5 seconds, then set the fork down, pretending fatigue. "Maybe I'll rest a bit," I murmured. She nodded, pleased, and went to clear the plates. The moment she left the room, Margaret moved quickly. We cut out a clean portion of the pie, sealed it in a sterile container, labeled it, and placed it in a cooler bag. The camera kept recording. 2 days later, the test results from the independent lab confirmed what I already knew. The pie contained a measurable dose of lorazepam, a prescription sedative illegal to administer without consent, especially to seniors. A drug known to cause confusion, short-term memory loss, and suggestibility. Exactly the kind used in elder coercion cases, the kind I had once prosecuted myself. I looked at the report, tracing the words with my finger, then whispered to myself, "You wanted a signature, Clara. Now you've signed your own fate." When it comes to survival, the smartest move isn't anger, it's paperwork. By the end of that week, I had stopped playing defense. The time for quiet observation was over. It was time to take control. The first call I made was to the bank. My voice was steady, polite, professional, the way it used to sound in court. "This is Vanessa Keller," I told the manager. "Effective immediately, I'm requesting a full lock on all my personal and joint accounts. No withdrawals, no transfers without my direct authorization written and verified." The manager hesitated, surprised. "Mrs. Keller, may I ask if everything is all right?" "Everything," I replied calmly, "is about to be." Next, I called Connor. "You'll be my custodian of record," I said. "Every title deed, every company document that belonged to Richard the First, want them in your hands. Temporary legal custody under professional counsel." He didn't need convincing. "Understood," he said. "You're building a wall she can't climb." Exactly. Then came the digital trail. I opened my laptop, typing an encrypted message to my financial advisor, someone I'd trusted for 2 decades. The subject line read, "Confidential Directive Freeze Keller Family Trust." The body was short, factual, and deliberate. Effective, immediately suspend all transactions and access to the trust. No fund movement until verified by both myself and attorney Connor Hastings. The reply came less than an hour later, acknowledged. Protective hold initiated. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen reflecting on the framed photo of Richard and me from 30 years ago. For the first time in months, I felt one step ahead, not trapped in Clara's web, but quietly pulling the strings myself. That afternoon, I visited the county legal office carrying my documents in a leather case. Using Ohio's temporary property oversight statute, I filed for what's called provisional legal supervision, a mechanism that prevents title changes or ownership transfers while an investigation is ongoing. When the clerk stamped the papers, I felt something click inside me. The familiar rush of strategy executed perfectly. By the time Clara texted that evening, "Hope you're resting, Mom. I'll stop by tomorrow to go over the insurance papers." The house she planned to steal was no longer legally reachable. She didn't know it yet, but every key she thought she had now fit a different lock. Revenge. I realized didn't always require fury. Sometimes it just required precision. 2 weeks passed in deliberate calm. I told Clara I needed rest, claiming my doctor had advised me to take a break from rich foods. It was an easy excuse. She seemed relieved at first, thinking I was finally giving in to age. What she didn't know was that I had quietly stopped eating anything she brought. No pies, no juices, no health smoothies. Within days, the fog in my mind began to lift. The dizziness faded. My hands stopped trembling. For the first time in months, I woke up with a clear head and steady breath. The difference was undeniable. That clarity became my fuel. Every morning, I sat at the dining table with a cup of black coffee and went through my growing stack of evidence. The hidden camera footage, the lab results showing traces of lorazepam, the forged paperwork, the email trail between Clara and Adrian, one message in particular where she wrote, "Once the title is under my name, we'll refinance and cover the hospital bills later." I printed everything, placed it in labeled folders, and sealed each one like I used to before trial. Connor came by on a Sunday afternoon, his overcoat dusted with snow. He laid his reading glasses on the table and flipped through the files one by one, his expression tightening with each page. "This is more than enough," he said finally. "We'll file for elder abuse and attempted property fraud." He gathered the documents, slid them neatly into a large envelope, and wrote in block letters, "Cleveland Heights, Police Department, Elder Protection Division." He paused before sealing it. "You understand, once this goes in, there's no turning back." I met his gaze calmly. "I never turned back from justice," I said. The next morning, Connor personally delivered the complaint and all supporting evidence to the Cleveland Heights Police Department. I didn't need to go with him. I'd done enough court appearances in my life to know that truth, once properly documented, didn't need theatrics, it just needed daylight. That evening, he called to confirm the report had been logged. "They'll review it immediately," he said. Then after a moment, he added gently, "You don't need to be angry, Vanessa. Just let the truth do the talking." I looked out the window at the snow-covered street, the same street where my husband once shoveled the sidewalk every winter. My voice was steady when I replied, "I've spent my entire life fighting for justice. This time, I'm simply representing myself." The courthouse smelled of polished wood and winter rain. It was the Cuyahoga County Court, and by the time I arrived, the gallery was already filled, journalists with their notepads ready, neighbors whispering, strangers curious to see the family drama that had somehow made its way into public record. I walked in slowly, cane in hand, composed and silent. I had faced juries fiercer than gossipers. Today, I would face something more dangerous, a performance. Clara arrived minutes later, looking like an angel who had lost her wings. She wore a simple gray dress, hair tied in a soft bun, and a white daisy pinned delicately on her chest. The picture of humility. The press cameras clicked as she stepped through the doors, her hands folded neatly before her, like a saint awaiting judgment. She even smiled shyly at one of the reporters, pretending not to notice the flash. When the judge entered, Clara's lawyer opened with a tone of polished concern. "Your Honor, this is not a case of malice," he began. "It's a case of compassion. My client, Mrs. Walters, has been caring for her elderly mother-in-law, who unfortunately suffers from progressive cognitive decline. The family's only wish is to ensure Mrs. Keller's safety through legal guardianship." Then Clara took the stand. Her voice trembled, practiced just enough to sound genuine. "I love my mother-in-law," she said, eyes shimmering. But lately she forgets things. She accuses people of hurting her. Last month she left the oven on all night. We were terrified something might happen to her. She paused, dabbing at a dry cheek with a tissue, perfectly on cue. "All we want is to protect her." Her words hung in the air, soft and poisonous. I watched her. The woman who once whispered when she signs it's done now, crying before the judge about love and duty. She even reached for Adrian's hand mid-testimony. He hesitated only a second before letting her hold it. The cameras caught that moment the picture of a devoted couple burdened by a difficult parent. I could see the conflict in my son's face: exhaustion, confusion, guilt. His eyes flicked toward me once, as if searching for reassurance or forgiveness or both. He wouldn't find it yet. I sat perfectly still, my expression unreadable. Years in law had taught me that silence, when used wisely, could be more powerful than any defense. Clara's voice softened into a sigh. "We never wanted this to go to court," she said. "But when someone you love refuses help, sometimes the law must step in." In that moment, I understood the brilliance of her disguise. She wasn't fighting me. She was rewriting the narrative, turning deceit into devotion, control into care. But I also knew something she didn't. Every word she spoke was being weighed against hard evidence. And soon, when the truth surfaced, her tears would no longer be seen as compassion, but confession. When the judge asked for my response, I didn't move. I didn't have to. Connor stood up beside me, buttoning his jacket with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent half a century turning truth into evidence. His voice was steady, clear, and sharp enough to cut through every lie that had been spoken. "Your Honor," he began, "Mrs. Keller does not need guardianship. What she needs is protection from the individual sitting across this courtroom." A faint murmur rippled through the audience. Clara froze, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. Connor continued without raising his voice, his calm authority filling the room. "Over the past month, Mrs. Keller has endured repeated attempts of manipulation, coercion, and medical tampering. Fortunately, the law allows precautionary measures under the Ohio Elder Protection Recording Statute. What you are about to see, Your Honor, was collected legally with full consent and compliance." He placed a small USB drive on the table, slid it toward the clerk, and nodded. The judge signaled for the evidence to be played. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the projector. Then the image appeared. Clara standing in Vanessa's kitchen, unscrewing the familiar spice jar. The camera caught everything: the tilt of her wrist, the white powder falling delicately into the pie, filling her lips, curling into a small, satisfied smile. And then the words, quiet, unmistakable: "Sign it quickly before she remembers." A collective gasp broke the silence. The sound echoed like thunder in a room where everyone had just witnessed the collapse of a facade. Clara's face went pale, her mouth opening, but no sound coming out. The judge leaned forward, expression hardening. Connor stepped closer to the bench, his tone precise. "As the recording shows, this was not an act of care, it was an act of intent. The compound found in that pie was lorazepam, an illegal sedative when administered without consent. The same substance that has been confirmed through forensic testing." In the back row, someone exhaled sharply, Adrian. His complexion drained of color, hands trembling as he stared at the screen. His gaze flicked between the video and his wife, disbelief melting into horror. When the screen went dark, he lowered his head into his hands. The courtroom fell silent again. Connor closed the file slowly and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the only confusion in this case," he said evenly, "belongs to the defendant, not the victim." Clara's face drained of color, though she tried to keep her composure. Her voice trembled just enough to sound desperate, not guilty. "This video," she said, clutching the table. "It's been edited. It's fake. Someone must have tampered with it." The judge raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond. Connor, calm as ever, reached into his briefcase and retrieved a folder. He opened it methodically, the way a surgeon might reveal the next instrument. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "we anticipated that claim. Here is the official forensic verification report from the Ohio Bureau of Digital Evidence. It confirms the footage is authentic, unaltered, and time-stamped in accordance with the state's Elder Protection Recording Act." He placed the document on the judge's desk, then held up another file. And here he added, "is the toxicology report from the independent lab. It confirms that the pie in question contained lorazepam, a sedative known to cause confusion and memory impairment when administered without consent. The sample was collected under supervision, sealed, and logged with chain of custody integrity." The room went silent again. Only the quiet shuffle of paper filled the air as the clerk accepted the documents. Clara's breathing grew shallow. Her perfect posture faltered. The actress had forgotten her lines. The mask of devotion cracked, and for the first time she looked exactly like what she was, a cornered liar. The judge nodded to the clerk, read the charge he ordered. The clerk's voice rang out steady and unmistakable. Under Section 29-302B of the Ohio Revised Code, elder abuse and intentional cognitive manipulation for property gain. Every word echoed off the courtroom walls like the tolling of a slow, merciless bell. Adrian sat beside his wife, hands gripping the edge of the bench. His lips parted, but no words came. When the judge turned toward him, he finally spoke, voice breaking. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know. I only signed because I trusted her." Clara turned toward him, panic flashing in her eyes. But Adrian couldn't look at her anymore. His head dropped, his shoulders trembling, the last ally she had just slipped away. I sat motionless. My notebook rested in my lap, pages filled with neat handwriting and small annotations. The quiet evidence of a woman who had prepared for every move before her enemies made it. My eyes stayed fixed on Clara, not with anger, but with clarity, the cold satisfaction of truth, standing unshaken before deceit. For years I'd watched liars crumble in the courtroom, but seeing it happen in my own family, that was different. It wasn't victory I felt. It was the silence that comes when justice finally takes its breath. When the judge granted me permission to speak, I rose slowly, steadying myself with the wooden bench. The room was silent, the kind of silence that hums with tension. I adjusted my ash-gray coat, the same one I had worn to every trial in my career, a quiet symbol of composure. My voice came out calm, unhurried, but each word landed with weight. "If this," I said, turning my gaze toward my son and his wife, "is what you call filial love, then I will accept being a stranger." My tone didn't waver. But remember, the law is not blind. It only waits for the right person to be brave enough to open its eyes. A faint gasp rippled through the courtroom, but I didn't look away. Clara's lips trembled. Her carefully painted innocence had collapsed. The daisy on her chest now looked absurdly out of place. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. The tears she had practiced so well earlier refused to fall this time. Adrian sat beside her, head bowed so low I could barely see his face. His shoulders quivered, and when a tear slipped down onto his clasped hands, it wasn't just guilt. It was realization. The child I had raised, the man I had trusted, had finally seen what I'd seen all along. The judge said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth had already spoken louder than any verdict. Around the room you could feel it, that rare, heavy stillness, when anger is replaced by understanding. People weren't looking at me with pity. They were looking with respect. I took a slow breath and glanced toward Connor. He met my eyes from across the table, and gave the smallest nod, professional restrained, but full of meaning. Two lawyers, once young and ambitious, now standing on the same side of justice one last time. I looked back at Clara and Adrian, not with hatred, but with clarity. "I forgive you both," I said softly. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It only spares me from becoming like you." Then I sat down. No applause, no triumph, just silence, pure and unshaken. In that quiet, I felt something deeper than victory. I felt peace. As the gavel struck and the hearing concluded, Connor leaned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Justice was served," he said, "and in the most beautiful way." The courtroom held its breath as the judge adjusted his glasses and began to read the verdict. His voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of finality. In the case of State of Ohio versus Clara Walters Keller, this court finds the defendant guilty of elder abuse and attempted property fraud under Section 2913.02b of the Ohio Revised Code. Clara's hands trembled on the table. Her once perfect posture wilted like a flower left too long without water. The white daisy on her dress, that symbol of false purity, seemed almost mocking under the courtroom lights. The judge continued his tone firm but measured. Considering the defendant's lack of prior convictions and the victim's request for restraint, the sentence is as follows: 2 years suspended imprisonment, 500 hours of community service, and a restraining order prohibiting any contact with Mrs. Vanessa Keller. A low murmur spread through the room. Clara's lawyer touched her arm, whispering something about leniency, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at the floor as though the world had quietly crumbled beneath her. The judge turned his gaze toward Adrian. As for Mr. Adrian Keller, he said the court acknowledges no criminal intent, but notes a concerning pattern of emotional dependency and neglect of moral responsibility. Therefore, this court orders mandatory psychological counseling a minimum of 6 months, focusing on emotional dependency and guilt recognition. Adrian swallowed hard, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, he didn't look at anyone. Not at his wife, not at me. He only nodded slowly, as if the sentence were a form of mercy he didn't deserve. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed through the courtroom like a quiet thunderclap, not violent, but final. Justice had spoken not through rage or revenge, but through clarity. The next morning, the story spread across Ohio. Headlines flashed in bold type. Once praised daughter-in-law accused of drugging her lawyer mother-in-law. Beneath it, a photo of Clara leaving the courthouse, her face, pale eyes downcast, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. The woman who had spent years crafting her image as a model of virtue was now the embodiment of disgrace. Neighbors whispered. Friends withdrew. Her so-called social charm dissolved overnight. The same people who once envied her perfect family now spoke her name in hushed tones, a cautionary tale of greed wrapped in politeness. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I simply watched the morning light spill across my kitchen table, my cup of tea steaming quietly. Karma didn't need fire and fury. Sometimes it arrived printed on newsprint, plain public and irreversible. The sentence was delivered quietly, but it hit Clara harder than any shout could have. 18 months of home detention, the judge said, with mandatory participation in the state's rehabilitation program for elder abusers. The words lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, slow, suffocating, impossible to ignore. When the deputies removed her ankle jewelry and replaced it with a monitoring bracelet, the look in her eyes changed. The defiance she once carried had dissolved into something else: humiliation. She stood there no longer the charming homemaker from the magazines, but a convict in a cardigan. Then came the part that broke her completely. The court declared a temporary suspension of her parental rights. Given the mother's current psychological state, the judge said the environment she provides may endanger the emotional development of her children. The words made Adrian flinch. He turned to look at her, but she avoided his eyes. It was the one punishment she hadn't anticipated losing the very audience she'd always performed for. By the next morning, her fall from grace had become public entertainment. The Cleveland Heights Gazette ran the headline in bold letters, "Sweet Angel of the Oven, accused of poisoning her lawyer mother-in-law." Local TV picked up the story, looping her photo, the one with her perfect smile and flour on her hands, now serving as the face of deceit. In the grocery stores and cafes of Ohio, conversations buzzed over coffee cups. "Can you believe it?" one woman whispered. "She used to drop off cupcakes for every PTA meeting." Another replied, "They said she volunteered at the church bake sale last year. Guess she brought more than sugar in those cookies." Her name became a cautionary tale. The organic food brand she once collaborated with released a short statement. "We strongly condemn all forms of elder abuse. Effective immediately, our partnership with Mrs. Keller is terminated." Within hours, her photos vanished from their website and social media pages. The smiling homemaker ambassador, who once represented wholesome values, was erased like a bad memory. The same neighbors who used to wave from their porches now crossed the street when she stepped outside. Her mailbox filled with letters she refused to open, not because she feared threats, but because the silence inside her house was punishment enough. The hum of the ankle monitor replaced the applause she used to crave. For me, it was poetic justice, not loud or cruel, just inevitable. Clara had built her world out of charm and deceit, but greed has a way of burning down its own walls. She didn't need anyone to destroy her reputation. She had done it perfectly herself. Adrian moved out quietly one cold January morning, carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and a face that looked years older than his age. He rented a small 1-bedroom apartment in Shaker Heights, the kind of place with peeling wallpaper and a lingering smell of old coffee, where no one asked questions and no one cared who you used to be. The sound of children's laughter still echoed in his mind, but now it came only on weekends when he was allowed to see them under supervision. At first, he tried to fill the silence with apologies. He wrote long letters to me, each one filled with remorse, self-blame, and pleas for forgiveness. "Mom, I didn't see what was happening. I was blind, stupid, weak." But I never replied. My silence was not punishment. It was mercy. Some lessons had to echo in the quiet before they could be understood. When we finally met again, it was by chance at a small cafe near the courthouse. He looked fragile, wearing the same coat he used to wear to Sunday dinners, now wrinkled and dull. He stood there for a moment, then said softly, "Mom, I'm sorry. I lost everything." I looked at him, feeling both sorrow and clarity. "You didn't lose everything," I said calmly. "You just lost your illusions. Love cannot exist where respect does not." My tone wasn't harsh. It was simply the truth, one that no courtroom could enforce, but every conscience eventually must. He nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes, as if he finally grasped the depth of what he had allowed to happen. After that, he began attending a small recovery group called Men Recovering from Emotional Manipulation. It met every Thursday night in a church basement, where the coffee was bad and the confessions were real. There, Adrian listened to stories that mirrored his own men, who had surrendered their will, their judgment, and their integrity for love that demanded obedience instead of partnership. Week after week, he started piecing himself together. He learned to speak without apologizing for existing, to make decisions without waiting for someone else's approval. The process was slow, painful, and quiet, but it was the first honest thing he had done in years. Sometimes he would drive past the old family home at night, parking a block away, just to see the porch light still glowing. He never knocked. He didn't need to. Some distances he finally understood must remain sacred if healing is to begin. When the case finally ended, I walked out of the courthouse into the pale winter light, and for the first time in months, I felt the cold without fear. Reporters crowded near the steps, microphones raised, calling my name. One of them shouted, "Mrs. Keller, do you have anything to say about the verdict?" I stopped for a moment, met their eyes, and said quietly, "I don't want to be famous because of someone else's crime." Then I walked away. The clicking of cameras followed me, but I didn't look back. Silence, I've learned, can speak louder than any headline. A week later, I began packing my life into boxes. The old brick house in Cleveland Heights, my home for more than 40 years, had become too full of ghosts. Every corner carried both love and betrayal. I wrapped photo frames in paper one by one, my husband smiling in his gray suit Adrian as a toddler holding my finger our wedding day under the oak tree in the backyard. These weren't just pictures. They were evidence of who I used to be and what I had survived. The hardest room to leave was the kitchen. That place once smelled of cinnamon and laughter. Now it held only memories of deceit. I touched the marble countertop where Clara used to roll dough, the oven where she baked her special pies. I whispered goodbye to the room, to the woman I had been, and to the lies that had tried to destroy me. When the sale was finalized, I didn't buy another big house. I chose a small apartment near a quiet park, a place with no echoes, no reminders, just peace. From there, I decided to do something that mattered. I took part of the money from selling the house and transferred it to the Elder Financial Protection Fund, a charity that helps seniors who've been financially exploited. At the bank, the young teller looked at the amount and smiled politely. "Would you like us to include your name in our donor bulletin, Mrs. Keller?" he asked. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I couldn't save everyone, but at least I can start with myself." He nodded slowly, perhaps understanding more than he could say. As I signed the receipt, I realized I no longer felt like a victim or a client, or even a mother seeking justice. I felt like myself again, a woman who had walked through betrayal and come out whole. When I stepped outside, the wind carried the scent of rain, and the city lights flickered softly. I pulled my coat tighter, smiled to myself, and thought, sometimes victory doesn't sound like applause. Sometimes it's just the quiet of your own peace returning. When the newspaper came out that morning, I didn't have to read the headline the world already knew. "Homemaker charged with poisoning lawyer mother-in-law in inheritance plot." It stretched across the front page in bold letters printed above a photograph of Clara being escorted out of court. I saw it while waiting in line at the grocery store. A woman beside me whispered, "That's her right, the one who tried to drug her mother-in-law." I didn't say a word. I simply placed my groceries on the counter and smiled faintly. Sometimes silence is the best way to let truth echo. Within hours, the story spread across social media. People who had never met me shared posts about the brave mother who exposed her manipulative daughter-in-law. Comments poured in, some furious, some admiring, all reflecting a single sentiment. "Don't underestimate the elderly." One woman wrote, "She taught everyone a lesson. Kindness doesn't mean weakness." Another replied, "Maybe now people will think twice before taking advantage of their parents." I didn't need applause, but reading those words I felt something rare. Not pride, but relief. The truth had finally become stronger than gossip. A few days later, a letter arrived with the seal of the Ohio Bar Association. It was a formal note of appreciation. "Mrs. Keller, your courage has helped bring attention to financial exploitation among seniors. The Ohio legal community thanks you for restoring faith in justice." I sat at my desk, reading it twice. My old colleagues would have called it recognition. I called it closure. I didn't fight this battle for honor, I fought it because silence would have meant surrender. Then came an invitation from a television network. They wanted me to appear on a talk show called Justice for Seniors. The producer's message was polite but eager. "Your story could inspire millions, Mrs. Keller. The public deserves to hear your voice." I replied with one simple sentence: "Justice doesn't need a stage, only the truth." They never wrote back, and I was grateful for that. I had already said what needed to be said, not through interviews or cameras, but through action. The rest belonged to the public now, and to the quiet hum of conscience that follows every real act of justice. As I sat by the window that evening sipping tea, I looked out at the faint glow of Cleveland Heights. The world outside kept moving, people hurrying home, children laughing on their bikes, life beginning again. And I thought to myself, maybe that's what justice truly is. Not punishment, not fame, just peace returning softly after the noise has passed. Clara's punishment wasn't loud or dramatic. It came quietly, a slow unraveling of everything she had built her false life upon. Each morning, the electronic ankle monitor blinked a dull green light, reminding her of boundaries she could no longer cross. For 18 months, she was confined to the walls of her own home, allowed out only for court-assigned community service. The same woman who once boasted about freedom, wealth, and appearances now had to report every hour of her day to an officer who barely remembered her name. The kitchen, once her kingdom, had become her prison. The walls were bare now, stripped of the pastel decorations she used to post on social media. The oven, her pride and weapon, was gone. She had sold it for cash during her first month of confinement. Without it, the room felt lifeless, as if even the air refused to forgive her. Sometimes, when the scent of cinnamon drifted from a neighbor's window, her stomach turned. The smell that once meant admiration and attention now only brought nausea and shame. Her friends, those who used to praise her grace and kindness, stopped calling. The mothers from the PTA group avoided her at the market. The women from the church bake sale crossed the street when they saw her coming. In their silence, she saw her reflection, a woman no longer admired, no longer envied, just pitied. Every evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table, staring at the 3 court papers taped to her door: her sentencing order, the community service schedule, and the restraining notice forbidding contact with Vanessa. They fluttered slightly whenever a breeze passed through the broken window latch. They were her only company now, the last witnesses to a story of greed gone rotten. Meanwhile, miles away, I sat by the window of my new apartment, the one facing the ocean. The light was soft that afternoon, and the sound of distant waves blended with the hum of a quiet life. I thought of Clara, not with anger, but with understanding that certain fires burn themselves out when they run out of lies to feed on. I sipped my tea, the warmth grounding me in the present, and smiled faintly. Karma had done what it always does. It returned everything to where it belonged. I didn't need revenge. I only needed peace, and finally I had it. The sun was rising when I moved into my new apartment, a small, quiet place perched on a hill overlooking the ocean. The air there was different. It didn't smell like courtrooms or hospital corridors. It smelled like new beginnings, damp soil, morning salt, and the faint sweetness of the daisies I had just planted by the window. For the first time in years, I wasn't defending anyone, and no one was trying to destroy me. I was just living. Each morning, I tended to my little garden. White daisies, the kind that used to sit on my husband's desk, now bloomed again under my care. I watered them slowly, speaking to them like old friends. You see, I told them once, life can grow back even after it's been cut to the root. It was my way of healing, not through anger, not through victory, but through quiet persistence. In the afternoons, I began writing again. Not legal briefs, not complaints or affidavits, but a book. Its title came to me easily: The Silent Victims' Stories of Elder Abuse and Justice. Each chapter told a story I had encountered or lived through. I didn't write for revenge. I wrote so that someone somewhere might recognize their own story before it was too late. One day, the phone rang. I recognized the voice before he even said his name. "Connor Hastings here," he said, his tone warm, a little amused. "I heard you've started writing. If you ever need a legal assistant, I'm available part-time, of course. My chess game isn't keeping me busy enough." I laughed softly. "Connor," I said, looking out toward the horizon, "the last thing I need is another lawyer in my life. But maybe I could use a friend." There was a pause on the line, gentle and knowing. That he replied, "I can manage." After we hung up, I stood by the window watching the ocean catch the light of dawn. The water shimmered gold, calm and endless. For so long, I had believed that survival meant fighting. Now I understood that true strength sometimes means choosing peace. I whispered almost to myself, life doesn't need revenge, only the courage to protect our own dignity. And to those who might one day find themselves where I once stood, lost, betrayed, doubting their worth, I have one thing to say. Don't let silence become your jailer. Speak up, tell your story, and help others find their way back to the light. Because justice doesn't end in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with a voice yours.